zero error, that is error resulting in the wrong calibration of the instruments. Check for parallax errors, that is due to the wrong positioning of the eye. So, final setting of the vernier height gauge should be made after the slider has been locked to the column. Height gauge should be tested for straightness, squareness and parallelism of beam, mirroring jaws and scriber surfaces. Vernier depth gauge. The other gauge is vernier depth gauge. Depth gauge are used to measure the depth of holes, cavities and other component features. They are available in various configurations depending on the specific applications. Depth gauge categorized include dial depth gauge, digital depth gauge, depth micrometers, thread depth gauge, flush pin gauge, depth rule, combination depth angle gauge and vernier depth gauge. Dial depth gauge displays data with a pointer or needle mounted in a graduated disc dial. The dial indication dimensions and positions around or form a reference point. Examples of depth graduations are 10 0 10, 45 0 45, 4 0 4, 50 0 50. Dial display design options include clockwise and counter-clockwise rotations, one or multi-revolution capabilities and an analog amplifier. With dial depth gauge, the analog amplifier provides a remote electronic equivalent to the mechanical display. Digital depth gauge present metrological data in numeric or alphabetic form. They often have data output capabilities that use serial or other formats. Digital readouts are precise digital displays that are integrated into dimensional depth gauges. Depth micrometers are another type of depth gauges with a digital option. Typically, depth micrometers are used for precision dimensional gauging. They are made of a ground spindle and an anvil that is mounted on a T-shaped frame. Micrometer depth gauge are also available in both scales and dial varieties. Depth gauges include thread gauges, flush pin depth gauges, depth rules, combination depth gauges and vernier depth gauges. Thread depth gauges measure the depth of the thread surface in a hole. Flush pin depth gauges are go-no-go functional gauges that rapidly assess the depth of the opening. Depth rules allows quick assessment. Typically, depth rules are used in application where precision is not a high priority. Combination depth angle gauges include the depth of orientation of a hole. The vernier depth gauges have graduation engraved or printed onto a surface, linear or datum. The main scale provides an indication of the gauge dimension to a standard precision level, for example, tenth. The vernier scale also allows an increased level of precision, for example, thousandths. Vernier depth gauges. It consists of the following main parts. One is the base of this depth gauge, sliding head of this depth gauge, beam of this depth gauge, and auxiliary head of this depth gauge. So, if we see the diagram of this vernier depth gauge, so this is the measuring face of this vernier depth gauge. The main parts are this base, clamping screw, vernier scale, main scale, fine adjustment screw, and the beam of this scale. This is the auxiliary head, clamping screw, and the sliding head. So, vernier depth gauge is used to measure depth of folds and slots. The vernier depth gauge is shown in figure have the following main parts. Number 1 is base of this depth gauge. The vernier depth gauge consists of a perfectly flat base. It is free from surface irregularities and waviness. The bottom surface of base provides datum surface from which the measurements are taken. Second main part of this depth gauge is the sliding head. So, here is the sliding head in this diagram. The sliding head is an integral part of base. It has a good sliding fit along the full length of the beam. It consists of vernier scale and clamping screw. The third main part of this vernier depth gauge is the beam. Here in this diagram, this is the beam of this depth gauge. It is a vertical graduated column having main scale. It is exactly perpendicular to the base. The sliding head slides over the graduated beam. The other main part of this vernier depth gauge is the auxiliary head. So, here in this diagram we can show that this is the auxiliary head of this vernier depth gauge. An auxiliary head is attached to the beam above the sliding head. It consists of fine adjustment screw. With the help of this screw, the end of the sliding head can be set at any point with fine adjustments. So, if we discuss the use of this vernier depth gauge, before measurement with the help of this depth gauge, ensure that the reference surface on which the base of the depth gauge has to rest is flat and square. The base is held firmly on the reference surface and beam is lowered into the hole until it contacts the bottom surface of the hole. The fine adjustment is made with the help of fine adjustment screw. The clamping screw is tightened and the depth gauge is removed from the hole. The readings are taken in a way similar to vernier calipers. So, use of vernier depth gauge. Before measurement with the help of depth gauge, ensure that the reference surface on which the base of the depth has to rest on flat square. The base is held firmly on the reference surface and beam is lowered into the hole until it contacts the bottom surface of the hole. So, the fine adjustment is made with the help of this fine adjustment screw. The clamping screw is tightened and the depth gauge is removed from the hole. The readings are taken in a way similar to vernier scale, which we already have discussed. The maintenance of vernier depth gauge. So, turn off the depth gauge by pressing on off button, or this is in case of electronic depth gauge. When the depth gauge is not in use, take out the battery if the depth gauge will stay ideal for a long time. Second is never apply voltage on any part of the depth gauge or engrave with an electric pen, as it might cause damage to the electronics. Cautions of Vernier depth gauge. The reference surface should be perfectly flat. The measuring face of the base should be free from dust and dirt. The final adjustment should be made with the help of fine adjustment screws. Before removing the instrument from the hole, the sliding head must be clamped on the beam with the help of clamping screw. The reading should be taken carefully to get the better results. All depth gauges should be calibrated at least once in a year, depending on how frequently it is used. If a gauge had an impact, it should be tested before use. If a gauge is not calibrated, it can be checked against an accuracy mark short line. When the display keeps flashing or does not appear, take off the battery cover as the arrow shows replace the battery with a new one. Note that the positive pole of the battery must be facing out. Next is the filler gauge. So, these are the various blades shown here. Thickness of blade varies from 0.03 to 1 mm. So, this is the filler gauge holder and these are the various blades. The thickness of these blades varies from 0.03 to 1 mm. So, filler gauge is a simple tool used to measure gap width. Filler gauges are mostly used in engineering to measure the clearance between two parts. They consist of a number of small lengths of steels of different thickness with measurement marked on each pieces. They are flexible enough that even if they are on the same hinge, several can be stacked together to gauge immediate values. It is common to have two sets of imperial units typically measured in thousandths of an inch. The metric typically measured in hundreds of the millimeters measurements. A similar device with wire or specific diameter instead of flat blades is used to set the gap in spark plugs to the correct size. This is done by increasing or decreasing the gap units, and gauges of the correct size just fit inside the gap. The length of steel or sometimes called blades, although they have no sharp edge. The types of filler gauges are taper filler gauge and parallel filler gauge. So, taper shown in the upper diagram and parallel shown in the lower diagram. A taper filler gauge is a filler gauge of tapered as opposed to parallel sharp. The blade of the gauge of a constant thickness, and the two types of gauges are used in a similar ways. So, dear students, these are some self assessment questions which may be important for examination point of view. So, you must go through for these questions, discuss where the vernier height gauge are used, discuss where a vernier depth gauges are used, write short notes on precautions to be taken while using vernier height gauge, least count of vernier caliper, what do you understand by the filler gauges. So, dear students, this is all about from today's discussion. Hope you understand and enjoy this session. Thanks.